Good afternoon. This is Dr. Joel Snyder, and I am delighted to be with you this afternoon to present a webinar on audio description. And thank you to Sylvia Stinson Perez for inviting me. I have a slide projected in front of you, and I'm going to practice what I preach about audio description, making visual images accessible. Much of what's on this slide is text. How do you make text accessible? You read it aloud, and I will do that. Audio Description Associates, LLC, the visual made verbal, presents Audio Description, If Your Eyes Could Speak, with Joel Snyder, PhD, President, Audio Description Associates, LLC, Director, Audio Description Project, ACB, American Council of the Blind. OIB-TAC, Older Individuals Who Are Blind, Technical Assistance Center, Mississippi State University, Friday, November 20th, 2020. And at the bottom of the slide, American Audio Description Symbol. And I do have an image there, a logo, a white square within which are two letters in bold black type, an A and a D. The left side of that A is tilted just a bit to the right, and to the right of the curve in the D, three curved lines. I stop there. Why do I say that? Well, beginning describers might go on and offer a bit of explanation. Those curved lines represent sound waves. Well, that's true. But there's nothing there that indicates that for sighted people. Why would you explain that for people who are blind or have low vision? Now, at best, it's unnecessary. At worst, it could seem patronizing or condescending. So that's a little bit about our audience for audio description. They're folks who live in the world just like all of us, and they learn just like all of us, and there's no reason why they might not understand that curved lines could represent sound waves. So let's begin our formal presentation. What better way to start a session on audio description than with description of a few visual images, two cartoons actually. The first one I have projected here, some of you might be thinking, gee, why does he have the cartoon so small? Why doesn't he enlarge that? Well, there's my point for you. Audio description is for folks who are blind or have low vision, and also folks that have to deal with a slide that hasn't been constructed correctly. That's pretty hard to see. The caption is almost unreadable. Well, let me help all you sighted people out with some audio description. The Fan by John McPherson. On a stage, at left, a woman in a flowing gown, her hands clasped in front of her, stands before a kneeling man in a doublet and feathered cap. He croons, "Why does thy heart turn away from mine?" At right, a man at the microphone, a microphone speaks. Basically, the guy with the goofy hat is ticked because this babe has been running around with the dude in the black tights. And the caption reads, "Many opera companies now provide interpreters for the culturally impaired." Yeah, that's a little more clear. And you know, when I first saw this cartoon, I saw that guy kneeling and I thought, what's that in his head? Maybe the woman just hit him with an axe or something. Had I been listening to the audio description, I would know. It's only a feathered cap. There you go. Let's try one more. Red and Rover by Brian Bassett. In the first panel, Red, a red-haired 8-year-old boy, is outdoors, lying on the ground against a tree, facing away from us, and his right arm is around Rover, a white short-haired dog, a lab beagle mix. A leaf falls. Red announces, "Brown." In the next panel, as Rover's tail taps, Red notes, "Orange, red, yellow." In the following panel, Red, orange, yellow, yellow. Next, Red turns toward us, eyes wide, and tells us, "Dogs only see in black and white." The final panel depicts a more full view of the tree, leaves scattered about the pear as red continues. Yellow, orange, brown, red, orange. Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Audio description for dogs. Colorblind dogs. I think that's right. I think dogs are colorblind. Is that right? And sometimes I show this and people will say, "Well, that's cute, Joel, but why are you talking about color? People who are blind don't know anything about color. Why would you talk about color?" Oh, well, there's another example of a misunderstanding about the audience for audio description. Sure, our audience is an extremely broad, heterogeneous one, dealing with people who are congenitally blind, blind from birth, perhaps with no light perception, all the way up to just older folks losing their vision from one concern or another. And indeed, most vision loss is age related. The audience that we have that is totally blind, no light perception, congenitally blind, that's a small part of the audience. Now, so we need to understand that. But so the rest of the audience, of course, grew up knowing color. They know color as a hue or as a frequency of light. But even folks who are congenitally blind, they grow up in the world. They know about color because color is far more than just a hue. Sure, green in this country means money or envy. Red is a warm color. Perhaps it denotes love. Sure. And so color, even for congenitally blind people, can be important. No reason to overdo it, but it is a part of audio description and shouldn't be neglected. Speaking of cartoons, I began working with folks who are blind uh, in my early 20s, reading talking books for folks who are blind, for the Library of Congress, for individuals. But I also was a volunteer reader for a radio reading service in Washington, D.C., the Washington Ear, where we read newspapers and magazines and such. And my first assignment was to read the Washington Post on Sundays. So here we go, cartoons, right? How do you read the Sunday paper without reading the comics, of course? And how do you how do you read the comics without describing the images? So there I was working with cartoons and description, and that has a little bit to do with the history of description, as I'll note for you in a little bit. So as a formal ongoing service for people who are blind or low vision, audio description was first developed by that group in Washington, D.C. in 1981. The Washington Ear doing description for performances at Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. I do want to note, though, that audio description was the subject of a master's thesis in San Francisco in the 1970s by the late Gregory Fraser. Mr. Fraser was actually the first to work out the concepts behind the act and the art of audio description, actually the first published literature on audio description, later to become a good friend of mine, and we lost him about 15 or 20 years ago. But in 1980-81 is when Margaret Fansteel, a blind woman, the head of the Washington Ear, took about 3 or 4 of us, put us together and said, we should try doing something with theater. Margaret and a blind fellow, Chet Avery, who's still with us, they were on an accessibility committee at Arena Stage. Arena was so excited about installing the first assisted listening system they ever had. And Margaret and Chet wondered, well, if it's just a matter of a microphone on the stage to boost sound for folks who are hard of hearing, couldn't someone actually hold the microphone out in the house or backstage or somewhere in a booth and use the microphone to describe images in the pauses between bits and pieces of dialogue or critical sound elements? They would be making the theater accessible to blind folks. Well, Wayne White, the house manager at Arena Stage, all credit to him. He said, let's give it a try. So Margaret, as I say, came back to the Washington Ear, and she pulled about 4 of us together. I was already there as a volunteer reader and a professional voice talent, an actor, an English teacher, and so became one of the first describers in the Ear's program, the world's first ongoing audio description service. So it's been about 40 years now that I've been working with audio description. And since that time, I've been fortunate enough to help performing arts groups, media producers, museums, schools, libraries, all kinds of venues around the world and on the web develop audio description programs. I do that through my own company, Audio Description Associates. And one of my contracts is with the American Council of the Blind to direct a program that I founded with them 11 years ago, the Audio Description Project. I've got on the screen now the home page from a recent version of the Audio Description Project's website. And I think the Audio Description Project has many initiatives and programs that we pursue, but the website is perhaps our most visible initiative and really provides a great deal of information. It is the go-to site really around the world for information about audio description. And here is the URL, acb.org/ADP. Audio description is a kind of literary art form. I'll narrow that. It's a type of poetry, really. No, I'm going to narrow that further. It's a haiku. And I say that because we use as few words as possible to provide a verbal version of the visual. The visual is made verbal and aural, A-U-R-A-L, he points to his ear, and oral, O-R-A-L, he points to his mouth, using words that are succinct, vivid, imaginative. We convey the visual image that's not fully accessible to a segment of the population. And by the way, new estimates by the American Foundation for the Blind now put that number at over 26 million Americans alone who are blind or have difficulty seeing, even with correction. And of course, for the rest of us sighted folks, we may see, but we don't observe. The images around us are not fully realized by sighted people, and we'll come back to that as well in a little bit. So it's useful for anyone who wants to truly notice and appreciate a more full perspective on a visual image, but it's especially helpful as an access tool for people who are blind or have low vision. And besides all those arts events, of course, over the years, the decades, I've provided description at weddings, at parades, circuses, at rodeos and other sporting events, and even funerals. The image I have in front of you now is a black and white photograph, and I want to chat for a bit about the history of audio description as outlined in my book, The Visual Made Verbal. Uh, you know, Audio description has been around since prehistoric times, since cavemen saying to another caveman, hey, there's a mastodon coming from the left there, or, what happened last night, or whatever. But in a formal sense, we're much younger than all of that. But, speaking of cavemen, I want to highlight for you the involvement of some politicians that have been exponents of audio description, whether they knew it or not. This black and white image that I have in front of you is of a politician. Some of you might recognize Fiorello LaGuardia. He's seated at a desk in his double-breasted jacket, wearing a tie, a round face with horn-rimmed glasses, a shock of dark hair over his ample forehead, and he has in his hands a sheaf of papers, and in his right hand a pen, and to the left a microphone, WNYC. Well, what's that all about? Well, Mayor LaGuardia, during the 1940s, he was a much beloved mayor. There was a newspaper strike. And of course, the 1940s, newspapers and radio, that's all you had for information. Well, Mayor LaGuardia didn't take the side of the workers. He didn't take the side of the publishers. He took the side of the people. Yeah, he gave the people what they were missing. And what were they missing? Especially on Sundays, they were missing those comics, right? So he went on the radio and read the comics to the people of New York City. And how do you do that, of course, without providing audio description, which he did. And I have recordings of Mayor LaGuardia actually providing audio description, describing the images, even though there was no such thing as audio description at the time. He was doing it. He was describing the images for his listeners. This image is another black and white photograph of a politician you may recognize, a very young Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, in his youth, was a sports announcer. And some people tell the story of his being in a booth in Illinois broadcasting play-by-play for a baseball game in New York City. Well, how's that possible? Well, he had a tele ticker tape, teletype kind of ticker tape in his booth with him, and it would spit out in real time what was happening with the ball game in New York City. Ball one, ball two, strike one, pop fly to left field. He would take that information and just using his imagination, he would create the ball game for his listeners in words and broadcast it out. That's exactly what describers have to do. We try to figure it all out ahead of time and write it out, but he was doing it extemporaneously, using his imagination to create images in the mind's eye of his listeners. Pretty impressive, really. Here's another politician for you, Mr. Barack Obama. You can see him. This is a color photograph. Mr. Obama is on the right, and he's shaking hands with an audio describer. That's me. They're at a White House ceremony where his staff knew there would be blind people there, and they should have access to the images being presented. So I was brought in as an audio describer. It was really quite impressive that during his administration, he went out of his way to make ceremonies at the White House, at the Department of Justice, and other agencies accessible. But not only that, he hired the first policy advisor for disability issues at the White House. And not only that, he had both of his inaugurations were described by me actually on ABC, also described on PBS. Mr. Trump's inauguration was also described. But beyond that, too, I want to highlight one thing. If you come to Washington, you can take a tour of the White House. It's self-guided, though. It's just a path in the public areas, about 20 minutes, and it's a wonderful thing, unless you're blind, in which case it's useless because there's nobody telling you anything. There are guards in each room, but they're there to make sure you don't steal the silverware or something, you know. No, we developed the first ever audio described tour during Mr. Obama's second administration. Recorded on little MP3 players that people could get when they came to the White House and listen to description of each room as they went through. All voiced, by the way, by a blind man. It was really quite significant. But perhaps even more significant is the fact that during Mr. Obama's second term, the 21st Century Communications and Video Accessibility Act was passed. CVAA, which for the first time mandated audio description for broadcast television. We've had captioning for 40 years. It's virtually at 100% now. Well, that was in 2012 when it went into an effect. We're at 2020 now, and only 7 hours per week for only nine broadcasters, and only in 60 some markets where description is required. So we've got a long ways to go. Hopefully the CVAA 2.0 sometime will allow us to go further with description on broadcast television. And I don't want to leave out, of course, our current president. Here's President Trump with one of his executive orders. I hereby proclaim Joel Snyder to be the finest audio description trainer in the world. That I can tell you. Donald J. Trump, February 2017. A little bit of audio description humor for you there. I want to take a moment now and just share with you a brief clip from a feature film, The Book Thief. You may have seen it about 10 years ago or so, and it really inspires the title for this webinar. If Your eyes could speak. The book Thief is partially about a young man who's being hidden in a basement area. You know, the windows are blocked out so no one can see in, and of course he can't see out. And in the home, he's being hidden by a family, and in that family is a young girl who will periodically go down to visit with him, to chat about words. And this is what happens.
Tell me, where do you get these words?
It's a secret.
And who would I tell? Can you do me a favor? Can you describe the day for me? What's it like outside?
It's cloudy.
No. Make the words yours. If your eyes could speak, what would they say?
It's a pale day.
Pale. Good, go on.
Everything's stuck behind a cloud. And the sun doesn't look like the sun.
What does it look like?
Like a silver oyster.
Thank you. I saw that.
Let me take a moment now to review the 4 fundamentals of audio description that I developed some years ago to outline what it takes to be a describer, to provide audio description in the most meaningful way. The first fundamental is observation. I've got a quote there from the famous American philosopher Yogi Berra. He said, "You can see a lot just by looking." Yeah. Well, it's true. It's true. An audio describer must relearn how to see, must no longer see passively, actively seek out what you can with your eyes and notice the world with a heightened sense of acuity and share those images. That's so important. The second fundamental, though, is editing, identifying the key visual elements. So, of course, what that means is you end up letting go of much of what you have observed because there's no time for it. Much of audio description is about what not to describe. You focus in on what is most critical to an understanding, he points to his head, and an appreciation, his hand is on his heart, of the visual image. The third fundamental is where we spend the most time, language, coming up with words. Very definitely, less is more. We want to be clear. We want to be imaginative. And we want to be objective. We don't want to substitute our subjective interpretation of what's going on for what has actually happened. If I see someone who's crying with tears streaming down their cheeks, that's an appropriate description. But were I to call her sad? No, that's subjective. That's a subjective interpretation. She might have just won the lottery, for all I know. She's deliriously happy, right? Language and how to use language and using your imagination. Coming up with silver oyster for the moon. Is the Washington Monument 555 feet tall? Well, sure it is. But it's also as tall as a 55-story building, or 50 some elephants stacked one on the other, or perhaps almost as tall as 2 football fields standing one on top of the other. Sure. And then finally, vocal skills, whether you as the describer are actually voicing the description or if another professional voice talent is making the description oral, there needs to be an understanding of speech skills, pronunciation, pronunciation, articulation, enunciation, as well as oral interpretation, because we make meaning with our voices. And one exercise I use oftentimes, I will put on the screen a phrase, "Woman without her man is a savage." Can we all agree on that? Well, I hope not. I hope not. But can you say it aloud? Don't change any of the words, just with the way you say it, make it mean the opposite. Woman without her, man is a savage. Let me help you see what description is all about by asking you figuratively. You don't really have to do this. You don't really have to close your eyes because I'm going to show you a clip from a feature film, The Color of Paradise. I'm just not going to show you the video. I'm going to play for you the original soundtrack. But this is a feature film. It was in the United States 20 years ago or something. A marvelous feature film, one of my favorites. You're just going to listen to it, the original soundtrack, and perceive it as a person who's totally blind might have experienced it 20 years ago in the movie theater. What can you glean about the film when you're limited to listening only? Let's try it. Oh my goodness, that was long. What was going on? Huh? Hard to tell, eh? Yeah. Well, let's experience the same excerpt again. You're all still blind. There will be no picture, but this time let's add the audio description that I wrote and voiced when this was broadcast on television about 20 some years ago. Will it make any difference? Let's see by listening.
Muhammad kneels and taps his hands through the thick ground cover of brown, curled leaves. A scrawny nestling struggles on the ground near Muhammad's hand. His palm hovers above the baby bird. He lays his hand lightly over the tiny creature. Smiling, Muhammad curls his fingers around the chick and scoops it into his hands. He stands and strokes its nearly featherless head with a fingertip. Muhammad starts as the bird nips his finger. He taps his finger on the chick's gaping beak. He tilts his head back, then drops it forward. Muhammad tips the chick into his front shirt pocket. Wrapping his legs and arms around a tree trunk, Muhammad climbs. He latches onto a tangle of thin upper branches. His legs flail for a foothold. Mohammed stretches an arm between a fork in the trunk of the tree and wedges in his head and shoulder. His shoes slip on the rough bark. He wraps his legs around the lower trunk, then uses his arms to pull himself higher. He rises into thicker foliage and holds onto tangles of smaller branches. Gaining his footing, Mohammed stands upright and cocks his head to one side. An adult bird flies from a nearby branch. Mohammed extends his open hand. He touches a branch and runs his fingers over wide green leaves. He pats his hand down the length of the branch. His fingers trace the smooth bark of the upper branches, search the network of connecting tree limbs, and discover their joints. Above his head, Mohammed's fingers find a dense mass of woven twigs, a bird's nest. Smiling, he removes the chick from his shirt pocket and drops it gently into the nest beside another fledgling. He rubs the top of the chick's head with his index finger. Mohammed wiggles his finger like a worm and taps the chick's open beak. Smiling, he slowly lowers his hand.
Ah, a bit more clear, yes? And shorter, too, seemed like. Huh. Well, now, just from having listened closely to the description of Muhammad and his interaction with the tree, what can you tell me about him? What do you think? Remember, the character would have been described much earlier in the film. This is an excerpt. What he looks like, what he's wearing, although he's got a shirt on with a pocket and shoes. I suspect that some of you will be surprised after watching the excerpt with the video for only 10 or 15 seconds. And as you do, consider the words used and why. The images that were chosen for description, why were they chosen? Would you have singled out others? Description is often about, again, what not to describe. Let's try it.
Mohammed kneels and taps his hands through the thick ground cover of brown curled leaves. A scrawny nestling struggles on the ground near Mohammed's hand. His palm hovers above the baby bird. He lays his hand lightly over the tiny creature. Smiling, Mohammed curls his fingers around the chick and scoops it into his hands. He stands and strokes its nearly featherless head with a fingertip. Mohammed starts as the bird nips his finger. He taps his finger on the chick's gaping beak. He tilts his head back, then drops it forward. Mohammed tips the chick into his front shirt pocket. Wrapping his legs and arms around a tree trunk, Mohammed climbs. He latches onto a tangle of thin upper branches. His legs flail for a foothold. Mohammed stretches an arm between a fork in the trunk of the tree and wedges in his head and shoulder. His shoes slip on the rough bark. He wraps his legs around the lower trunk, then uses his arms to pull himself higher. He rises into thicker foliage and holds onto tangles of smaller branches. Gaining his footing, Mohammed stands upright and cocks his head to one side. An adult bird flies from a nearby branch. Mohammed extends his open hand. He touches a branch and runs his fingers over wide green leaves. He pats his hand down the length of the branch. His fingers trace the smooth bark of the upper branches, search the network of connecting tree limbs, and discover their joints. Above his head, Mohammed's fingers find a dense mass of woven twigs, a bird's nest. Smiling, he removes the chick from his shirt pocket and drops it gently into the nest beside another fledgling. He rubs the top of the chick's head with his index finger. Muhammad wiggles his finger like a worm and taps the chick's open beak. Smiling, he slowly lowers his hand.
Sure, Mohammed is blind, and clearly that's what the director was focusing on when he zeroed in on his hands touching the branches and the leaves and patting down the leaves, fingering a nest, using his hands and his fingers throughout. And of course, then the description was relaying the intent of the cinematographer and the director. Sure. Well, let me walk you through the actual audio description script for this excerpt because I've annotated it with a few points about description that I think will be helpful. Here you go. At the very beginning, thick ground cover of brown curled leaves. Well, brown curled leaves, that tells you, of course, something about the time of year. It's fall. And brown, again, color has been shown to be important to people with low vision, even people who are congenitally blind. A little bit later, there's a gasping, a chirping for 2 seconds. And that's a cue, and it's a very precise one because that's when we come in with the next bit of description. Timing is critical in the crafting of description. We weave descriptive language around a film's sound elements. Later in that phrase, he curls his fingers around the chick and scoops it into his hands. He doesn't grab it. He doesn't just pick it up. No, he scoops it. Vivid verbs help conjure images in the mind's eye. And then a bit later on, Muhammad starts as the bird nips his finger. He taps his finger on the chick's gaping beak. He tilts his head back. Then he drops it forward. Muhammad tips the chick into his front shirt pocket. Taps, tilts, tips. Well, description, like much poetry, is written to be heard. Alliteration adds variety and helps to maintain interest. A bit later on, an adult bird flies from a nearby branch. Well, what to include? Why did we include that? Well, it's important. That adult bird returns in the next scene, perhaps the bit of foreshadowing that the director of the film intended. And then at the very end, he rubs the top of the chick's head with his index finger. Be specific. Precision creates images. And then Muhammad wiggles his finger like a worm. Ah, like a worm. Similes paint pictures. And of course there's no worm there. It was just imagination that we figured, well, conjuring the image of a worm will help you see what he's doing with his finger. Speaking of blind children, not too long ago, I conducted a workshop in New Haven with daycare workers and reading teachers on what I think represents a new application for audio description, literacy. We experimented with with developing more descriptive language to use when working with kids and short films or picture books. Now think about that. Picture books rely on the pictures to tell the story. But a teacher trained in audio description techniques would never simply hold up a picture of a red ball and read the text. There it is. See the ball. No, I think he or she might add, that ball is red, just like a fire engine. I think that ball is as large as one of you. It's as round as the sun, a bright red circle or sphere. What has the teacher done? Introduced new vocabulary, invited comparisons, and used simile with toddlers. So by using audio description, clearly you make those books accessible to children who have low vision or are blind, and you help develop more sophisticated language skills for all kids, for all people. A picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, maybe, but the audio describer might say that a few well-chosen words can conjure vivid and lasting images. Indeed, I was quite pleased to provide description for the first time ever with a staff at the National Captioning Institute, where I started the Described Media program. We did description for Sesame Street. And I remember being quite heartened by a particular letter we received from a blind parent of sighted children. She'd been blind from birth, and she remembered Sesame Street as a kid, listening to the songs and the silly dialogue. She loved it. But now, with audio description for the first time, she could follow along with her kids and the antics of Elmo and Bert and Ernie and all the other denizens of Sesame Street. We also provided description for the Spanish version of Sesame Street, Plaza Sésamo, and we also added description to Sesame Street's commercial DVDs. So here's a little sample for you, a little excerpt from Elmo's World with audio description.
Elmo stands beside Dorothy's fishbowl.
Hi! This is Elmo's World! Oh, Elmo's so very happy to see you. Oh, and so is Dorothy. Say hello, Dorothy.
An orange goldfish.
Oh, guess what Elmo's thinking about today?
Elmo glances around himself.
Hear that? Yeah!
Elmo dances to a purple door and opens it. Outside, people and puppets sit on steps on Sesame Street. The doorway stretches wide.
Oh, thank you.
The people and puppets wave at Elmo. Elmo turns around.
Oh, Sesame Street.
Oscar pops up.
Hey, get lost!
Oscar. You know Sesame Street.
Elmo and the others dance.
Yeah.
Now a bird puppet flies over Sesame Street. Alan dances with a broom. A man in ballet tights jumps up and down with letters. People and puppets bounce. 4 cartoon baby dragons appear. A man dressed in a big letter M dances on a beach. A bat puppet follows the count. Maria kisses Luis on the cheek. A blonde woman plays piano. A cartoon orange wears sunglasses. Grover the waiter drops dishes. Big Bird plays with children. Rosita dances with sheep puppets. A boy wears a red mask and yellow cape. Alpha Boy. Bert struts. Cartoon men dance. A bearded man dances with a cane. A woman plays guitar. Ernie holds a banana in his ear. Telly does an Egyptian dance. A woman claps while puppets sway. Zoe dances with a boy and girl. A man sits at a piano and squeezes a rubber ducky. A man plays an electric guitar. Gordon waves from a window. Cookie Monster hugs a doll. Now Dorothy swims by a small green lamppost in her bowl. A sign, Sesame Street.
Look, Dorothy's been thinking about Sesame Street, too.
It wanted to play itself again. I have a true story for you in closing the recorded portion of this webinar. A blind fellow was once visiting a museum with some friends, and a sighted woman had the temerity to come up to him and say, "Excuse me, but what are you doing in a museum? You can't see any of the exhibits." Well, he was a little taken aback, but his response, "I'm here for the same reason anyone goes to a museum. I want to learn, I want to know, I want to be a part of our culture." His inability to see shouldn't deny him access to our culture, and I believe it's the responsibility of all of our arts institutions, of any public institution, to be as inclusive as possible. It's really about access to culture, and that's everyone's right. There simply is no good reason why a person with a particular disability must also be culturally disadvantaged. No. I do want to emphasize one point. In the United States, the principal constituency for audio description, people who are blind, has an unemployment rate of about 70%. Well, I believe that with more meaningful access to culture and its resources, people become more informed, more engaged with society. They become more engaging individuals, and I think more employable. Finally, I'm in the Washington, D.C. area, so I thought I'd end with an example of description that's particular to Washington, D.C. I mentioned Mr. Obama's commitment to accessibility and audio description in particular, and indeed, in 2015, his staff prepared a video Christmas card to the nation and a wonderful video tour of the White House with no talking, just a background of a jazz version of Come All Ye Faithful. Well, someone realized that's not the most inclusive piece to send out because nobody who's blind would have any idea what's going on. Well, they got in touch with me, and I was able to help them with preparing an audio described version of the 2015 Obama Christmas card, video Christmas card to the nation. Here it is.
A video tour of the White House at Christmas time. In the Red Room, a wreath with red ornaments and candy canes. In the Grand Cross Hall, a garland with gold balls frames the entrance to the Oval Blue Room. At center, the White House Christmas tree reaches to the ceiling. The Green Room fireplace is surrounded by a garland with green bows. George Washington's portrait in the state dining room seems to present two brightly decorated trees. In another room, a tree boasts festive ornaments, including a Santa standing at attention by his sleigh. A hall's arched ceiling is matched by curved stretches of silver bells and balls. Another hallway's chandelier crystals are intertwined with snowflake designs. Models of the Obama's Portuguese water dogs, Sonny and Bo, sport red and black scarves. The White House Library boasts 6 trees, one decorated with small white books and bows. The China Room displays presidential china and dozens of gifts wrapped in red. A sparkling red ball on a tree mirrors its surroundings. A nearby tree has dozens of red balls and white lights. Seen through window panes, a cadre of snowmen, some with bow ties or caps and scarves, stand like sentinels outside the West Wing. Indoors, miniature snowmen clustered together with carrot noses and crooked smiles. Atop a fireplace mantle, a tiny Santa sits in his red sleigh, pulled by small gingerbread reindeer. A model of the White House beams with indoor lights. Outdoors, the south portico of the actual White House is brightly lit, garlands at its balconies. Happy holidays from whitehouse.gov.
And the last slide has my contact information. My website is audiodescribe.com. My email address, jsnyder@audiodescribe.com. I'll mention once again the website address for the Audio Description Project, acb.org/ADP. And there is my book, The Visual Made Verbal, a comprehensive training manual and guide to the history and applications of audio description, available on Amazon.com. And I do want to mention as well, one of the initiatives of the Audio Description Project is 2 Audio Description Institutes each year, an intensive period of time where we train audio describers. We've done this 17 times, and our 18th Audio Description Institute will be virtual in March 2021, 5 days, 4 hours each afternoon on each of those days. So if you did not enjoy the last 45 minutes with me, you certainly will not enjoy 5 days with me in March of 2021. In any event, more information will be available soon at acb.org/ADP. Thanks so much for having me. I welcome your questions now or by email if you think of something a little bit later on. Thanks.